Actually, I'll just carry on because while our next panel comes to the stage, I'd just like to point out that we have recently released our own study called Connected and Protected, which looked at the attitudes and behaviors of parents and teens across the USA. Yes, come on up, folks. Particularly regarding levels of awareness and usage of Gen AI. I'll sit there. Thank you. Roughly half of US parents use parental controls, which, depending if you're a glass half full kind of a person or a glass half empty, that's either good news or terrible news. Whichever way you look at it, we still have a long way to go to make parental controls easy to find and easy to use. So have a look at the report. We included it in your bag today. And for those watching online, you can find it at FOSI.org and follow the links to our online safety survey. All right. Oh, look. Hello. Suddenly there's a panel up here. This is great. Does someone need a... You do with that. All right. Well, welcome. Hello. How are you doing? Good. Like we did the first panel, I'm just going to... this is our wonderful research panel, if you're following along on your agenda. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us all about you?
I start?
Yeah, you start. Go ahead.
Okay, good.
I think you just talk and it magically starts to work.
Maybe
just keep going.
Yeah, okay. I will keep going. Okay, good. So, hello. My name is Sandra Cortesi. I am based at the Technical University of Munich, the last 16 years based at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. I do participatory research with young people at the intersection of technologies and the topics that impact their lives. 4 things keep me busy, 4 topics right now. The first one is well-being, trying to understand what well-being means in a digital world and developing a new concept of well-being. Second topic I am working on is skills, trying to understand the skills young people need nowadays. Third topic is a new topic I'm really excited about, and maybe some people in here, is I just built a creativity lab. So trying to shift narratives and perspectives. And the fourth topic, I may get to talk a little bit later, is I'm working on safety issues, but we're releasing a report at the end of the month about frontiers in digital child safety. And so delighted to talk about that. And then you said philosophical.
Yes, I'd asked each of you for a bonus question. Do you have?
Yes.
Have
I debated with the young people in my team. So I would say I'm a hopeless optimist with a healthy sense of skepticism or pragmatism surrounded by Stoics. And then my team said, no, Sandra, that's not the answer you should give. What about your work? So I have 3 colleagues that I learned from. One is Sabello. So I believe in Ubuntu philosophy, that it's more than just the individual, that we're a community-based society. I learned from Alexa that we should shift narratives from kind of a deficit narrative to a strength-based narrative. So I am trying to follow that as good as I can, and then I end with something positive. So Annabelle on my team said, no, you should talk about Taylor Swift and the Swifties. So I believe I'm a professor for participation and diversity, so I believe in community and youth agency. Yes.
So the Swift School of Philosophy.
Exactly, yeah. I was going with Aristotle, but I said, no, I need to do something like...
Thank you so much for that. All right, beat that. Taylor Swift, that's the bar.
Goodness, that's one to beat. So hello, and thanks so much, Stephen, for the invitation. Amazing to be here. And thanks to Netflix as well for hosting. And I'm Julia Davidson. I'm Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice, focusing on online harms and cybercrime. And I've been working in the child protection area for goodness, I'd say about 40 years, long before we even started to think about what potential harms might look like online. But most recently, I've been working on a series of very interesting projects. Goodness, I've worked in projects all over the world during my career. So I've worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Africa. We're currently working in Africa again with colleagues in Rwanda and Kenya, looking at child online protection. We developed the child online protection policy for the Rwandan government in 2019, which they implemented. Just been working on a really interesting study, Horizon funded, European funded, looking at young people's illegal use of the internet in 8 European countries. So 8,000 young people responded to our survey. So that's a pretty interesting study. But you know, throughout my career, I can talk about the research I've worked on, but really I've been reflecting lately on the impact of that research, and that's the important piece, isn't it? Because we can do all the research we want, but if it doesn't have an impact on policy and practice, then really what's the point? So we're setting up at the university a child online harms think tank to try and bridge the gap between policy and research. And just very quickly on the philosophy question, which had me thinking too, but it took me back to my early criminology days. I was a student at the LSE and was very privileged to work with a really famous group of criminologists. Amongst them was a person called Stan Cohen, and his work really focused at that time on moral panics. And one of his key writings was Folk Devils and Moral Panics. And I was thinking, you know, I was privileged to have him as a tutor. And actually that really resonates, I think, in the context of some of the work we're doing here. So a lot of my work has been at the sharp edge. I've worked a lot with victims, with perpetrators as well. And I think we always have to be cautious about the way in which our research is presented, because we don't want to fuel moral panics, and I think we'll get on to the moral panic discussion shortly. And I just wanted to say that my work is also, I think, tempered with all the work I've done with victims, so it's about incorporating a victimology perspective as well to make sure that victims' voices are heard in our discussions around moral panics.
Brilliant. Pete?
Hi everybody, I'm Pete Etchells. I'm a professor of psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University in the UK. I think you've got my book under your chairs in your bags.
And it's signed.
Hopefully it's enjoyable.
Signed.
It's signed as well. So yeah, I do a lot of science communication, a lot of writing in this area, and thinking about how do we translate this very difficult, very broad area of research into something meaningful, something productive and useful for people to take into what is a very heated debate at the minute. So so I'm sort of thinking about things in terms of work that I'm doing at the minute, thinking about things that I could do along those sorts of lines. So I'm trying to think of a possible follow-up for the book that you've got today. I'm starting a podcast with a guy called Andy Shabilsky, who's at the Oxford Internet Institute, who some of you may have heard of, where we're going to talk about the research base and how do we navigate this sort of online life as parents. Research-wise, I'm interested at the minute in looking at perceptions of things like smartphone bans. How do they work in the long term? We know that lots of schools already have them in various sorts of ways, shapes and forms, but when you get young people going into university settings, do we see any meaningful effects from those things that have been happening earlier on? And more broadly looking at how do we evaluate things like digital mental health interventions? So hopefully in the next year or so, if it gets funded, we're hoping to do some work looking at coming up with a set of minimum expected standards for work in that sort of space. I spent way too much time thinking about the philosophy question this past week.
Good.
I really enjoyed it. So in terms of things that I think really speak to the way that I try and do things, I'm a big fan of Ludwig Wittgenstein. In some of his later work, he talked about this idea of language games, that when we assign meaning to something, it's not as simple as saying, here's an object and it's got a name, but there's a social context to that as well that will be different for different people, and different groups play different language games. And it's really hard sometimes to translate across barriers. So the language games that we play as scientists make sense to scientists. They don't necessarily make sense in the way that we think they do to the public or to policymakers or to parents. And it's in those transitions that misunderstanding happens and things start to go wrong. So the classic thing for me as a scientist is that we have a very specific meaning of what we mean by significant, statistical significance, right? That is very different to what your average person on the street might understand by the word significance, and you'd be surprised how that goes wrong so often. So I'm interested in how we navigate what is increasingly becoming a very emotive, very heated, very complex topic that has different stakeholders with these different language games, so that we can kind of cross those barriers more effectively.
Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you. Jessica.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Piotrowski. I'm a professor at the University of Amsterdam, so welcome to my home. So I did not cycle in today, but I live about 15 minutes away. So I hope you're enjoying Amsterdam. My professorship is in digital society, and I've been doing this for about 20 plus years now, 25 years. And I focus on how young people are becoming resilient or not to the digital spaces that we're living in. In the Netherlands, I spend a lot of time working on an idea called digital competence. You might often hear the word digital literacy used, but here I'm going beyond just how they understand the space, but really the skills they need to thrive in this or not. And I lead a national monitor here where I study young people from 10, as we say, to 110. So I also look at the family ecosystems and really try to understand how we are, all of us, what skills we have, and actually what we don't have, and trying to identify, if we can understand where the gaps are, how do we help in these spaces? And so, for example, you see right now very, very much misunderstanding, understandably so, in things like AI and generative AI and what that looks like. So I spend a lot of time on that. That brings me, because I'm also the director of the Center for Research on Children, Adolescents, and the Media at the UvA, at my university. And so that means I lead a lot of different related pieces on the digital space. So whether that would be understanding how young kids are engaged with smart speakers at the home, and do they use them or not, and what does that mean, to understanding how young kids find solitude or not in the digital space, to also thinking through what's been taking up a lot of my energy these days is the very frequent discussions we're hearing here in the Netherlands about the social media ban. I work a lot across the aisle, so I spend a lot of time, whether it's with TikTok or Snap or Meta or YouTube. I'm on the youth advisory board for them, et cetera. So I spend a lot of time working with platforms. I'm not pro-media and I'm not pro-regulation per se, I'm pro-kid. So in that regards, it's meaning finding a way to figure it out across everybody. But I am very clearly anti-ban, and that will be, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you know that well. Because I worry that what we're doing is putting a Band-Aid on something that actually is a far bigger problem that we need to think about. And I think there's just much more in that. And so I've been spending a lot of my energy the past few months in every place and space I can talking about this, especially with the Dutch government. And I have a new project, data comes out next week, trying to do a better job of understanding, at least here in the Dutch context, the voices of parents themselves, and actually, because that's a voice we're missing, and the voice of young people themselves in these conversations. So happy to share some of that today. I did not think ahead about the philosopher conversation. I'm more going with the flow here. But I was thinking a little bit about when I started studying this 20-ish years, 25-ish years ago. I originally was taught about John Locke's idea of how a young child develops, and this idea of the blank slate, the tabula rasa. They are born with nothing, and we put this all in them. And then as I studied and learned, of course, I started to really push back against that and find myself leaning to theorists that also talk about the active part of the young person themselves, too, that not everything is pushed on them, but they play a shared role in that space. And although there's a lot of theorists that I lean towards as a geeky academic, I find myself often in the idea of ecosystems, really, that there's these different circles that surround a young person, and they interact in different ways. So the players and people in this room, when you're shaping the ecosystems of young person's media spaces, that plays a role on their families and their communities and their schools, and they play a role back, and really trying to understand that messiness. So Locke inspired me to think about the influence we have on young persons, but Bronfenbrenner in this case was a later developmental psychologist that made me think about really how all of this messiness is more authentic, and also why it's so hard often for us to get our message across in science, because the truth is complex, and complex headlines rarely get attention.
Well, that's a perfect segue back to moral panics, because when I first got involved in this space way back in 1995, there was a very flawed piece of research called the RIM study, which got itself onto the front cover of Time magazine, which led to a Senate Judiciary hearing that I testified at, where the senators were freaking out about the amount of porn that was on this new thing called the World Wide Web. And that turned into the Communication Decency Act, which of course ended up failing at the Supreme Court and so on and so forth. Fast forward another 10, 11 years, an awful television program called To Catch a Predator, anybody? Which was a sting operation showing creepy guys going to what they thought is a 15-year-old girl's house. Turns out it's a police officer. They catch him, and it's television. It's entertainment. And it, of course, caused another moral panic about the number of predators. Of course, you know, it's far more likely, child sexual abuse happens far more likely in the home, trusted neighbor or friend, which is not something you would make a television program about. So anyway, another moral panic. But here we are, yet again, in another one. A certain book came out last year. I'm not going to give it oxygen, but let's just say it has stirred up a lot of concern, which that concern has turned into social media bans and also bans of phones in schools. Let's talk about bans. Jessica, you might as well. I'll hand it back to you. What's a ban for? I mean, what's the philosophy behind a ban, and why is that not such a great idea?
Yeah, so I think the fact of the matter is there is something going wrong right now, and that we would not find, if this message came out, we should ban things, if it really had no confirmatory bias. If we didn't feel that something was off, we would sort of disregard it, right? And we would say there's nothing there. But there are some struggles. We heard today from the panel before us, for example, there are things wrong. There are kids struggling. Kids are struggling in lots of different spaces. Parents are identifying it. Regulators are identifying it. So when you hear there is a ban, it seems like maybe this is the solution. The active confirmatory bias is what is at work here. And so it's why you see people leaning into it. And it is simple on the surface. It's actually not. If you're a practitioner of this and you're thinking, how do we do it? Infrastructure is quite complicated. But on the surface, it sounds simple. And if you're struggling, and you have this confirmatory bias and you see a problem and you hear a solution, it's very easy to lean into where that is. But what the research shows us is, and most of you in this room are working with young people in different ways, so you know this in different ways, is one, banning doesn't work. Young people find another way, first of all. Second of all, when they find another way, it ends up being in a more dangerous space than the actual spaces they have. And third of all, it violates their actual rights. If you're from a country that signed the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child, for example, the rights to the digital space is actually one of their rights. So in this regards, we need to actually be doing better, I think, in my proposition, on creating better spaces for them and living to that part of the Charter of the UN, and not per se saying, let's just remove it altogether. But I do have sympathy for the argument. And actually, as much as it's taken a lot of my time, I'm oddly a bit, this sounds weird to use the word happy, but I am happy or glad that this conversation is happening, because I do actually find it incredibly important to make sure we are surfacing the rights of young people and making sure we recognize the places and spaces they're using and giving it this attention. So as much as I'm tired of the fight, I am hopeful for where we go from here if the people studying it and really doing the true science are able to find a voice. And that's what I think people like Pete are trying to do right now, and being able to say, hey, here's what we see, and let's really act on this. Let's not act out of fear, which is very common. That's where the moral panic is, but let's act out of a place of science.
As a former psychologist, a recovering psychologist, what I recall is that fear activates the old ancient brain, the fight or flight. And it switches off the frontal cortex, which is where we have, rational thought and all that kind of good stuff. Pete, pros and cons of bans.
Well, I agree with Jess in a lot of ways, that I understand where the idea of them comes from, and they feel like they should work. And we've got some data on this that
Do we?
people feel like that they feel like they should work.
Oh.
If you look at what happened in South Korea 10, 15 years ago, the internet was effectively, or playing video games was banned for kids under the age of 16 between midnight and 6 a.m. because we were worried about how much sleep they weren't getting. So if they're playing video games at 2 a.m. and you ban them from doing that, then they can't play video games, so they'll sleep more. So job done, right? That wasn't based on evidence. That was based on a feeling that it should just work, right? Of course it should work. And it took about 6 or 7 years for us to figure out that actually it spectacularly doesn't work. if you look at how much extra time kids were getting sleep per night, pre versus post ban, they were getting on average about 1.5 minutes extra sleep after the ban than before. They were spending more time on the internet, they just shifted it to earlier in the day. So what feels on day one like it does work, and if you go and talk to kids and they'll say, yeah, I'm not playing games at 2 a.m. anymore, that we kind of pat ourselves on the back and go, job done, it's fixed. But it's not, and it's hidden what's going on, and it's created a bigger problem. And that's the kind of fundamental worry that I have about bans, is that there's not much good evidence to support them. And we have to be careful in saying that as well, because we need to be careful about what sort of ban we're talking about. The evidence for banning social media for under 16s will be a different thing than banning smartphones in schools, and there's all sorts of different definitions that we need to figure out there. Language is important. But generally, these things, if they come from a place of fear, they get enacted very quickly and in the wrong sorts of ways that don't do the thing that we want to do. They don't actually help.
Right. Either of you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting discussion, and I think the issue is, that the research, if we as a research community can say that the problem is that the research is patchy, it's not, there's no certainty around the research. A lot of it is still in its infancy, particularly around bans. But what we do know from working with young people is that if you say you can't do this, they'll find a way to do it in another way. I mean, I'm just drawing on perhaps some of the evidence from the big study that we did, that I mentioned to you, the European study, looking at illegal behaviours. Well, young people in that study had any number of mobile devices. I mean, there's no way that I think a ban would deter young people from doing what they want to do. So I think the difficulty is, while the research is kind of patchy and piecemeal, and we do know that there is some parental concern around this from research. Some parents would support the use of bans. I know that to be true. But I think, while the research is inconclusive, it's very difficult for us to say with any certainty, well, it will work or it won't work. And so it's a particular bandwagon that it's convenient to jump on. And I think it's probably detrimental. We know that, but some young people, for example, perhaps young people who are neurodiverse, who've got other challenges, vulnerable young people, really need kind of ongoing access, and a ban would not work. So I think it's highly problematic given the research landscape. And I think as researchers, we need to hold our hands up and say, look, the jury is out in terms of the scientific evidence, because we want the evidence to be conclusive, and we want to be able to say to policymakers and practitioners, yeah, absolutely, the evidence is there, and we know this will work, but at this stage, we don't.
But maybe I can pick it up right where you ended. So I work with several governments, and I currently do not want to trade jobs. Regulating the space is complicated. But maybe 3 approaches that I hear often why some people are opting for bans. And I think the first one has to do with what you just explained. We as academics, we try to be humble. We were discussing it earlier. Say, here's what we know, and here is what we don't know. Or you said patchy, you said inconclusive. And I think in part we are at fault. Yes. Why people are coming up with bans, because first is, so people say we're taking a precautionary approach. So until you figure out, or until we here have the evidence, I am just worried about possible harms, and until then I will restrict until you have the evidence. So that's the first approach. I can somewhat sympathize, but I have difficulties also. The second approach is kind of paternalism. I think a lot is going on in the world. We see young people struggling, and so our instinct is, oh, we need to protect. And so in this protection mode, restriction is just easier than kind of other types of ways to go about it. The third one that drives me, that makes me upset, is when they say it's in the best interest of the child. I say, no. Have you actually spoken to young people lately? And do you know all the other things colleagues said about the rights of young people and so forth? What I agree on two things. One is the problem won't go away, and maybe just to add to the statements, what I am most worried about. I think the ban fight we lost, but what I'm most worried about is that the schools, particularly where they are banning phones, I don't see an increase in skill programs. So I feel like we're banning, but at the same time, we're not equipping, we're not supporting. And so what happens when then a young person goes into the workforce? In Switzerland, I have a heavy German accent, sorry about that. But in Switzerland, you enter the workforce at possibly 14, 15, 16 when you do an apprenticeship or you start Anyway, and by age 16, who taught you how to navigate this space?
Okay. By the way, for the record, FOSI is against blanket bans, but we are for thoughtful restrictions, which involve young people, parents, teachers, etc., and done at the local level rather than at the national level. Not a great idea to just, like in South Korea. It occurs to me, I'm going to forget my next question because I think what I would love to do, start, and then we go back down. What's happening with AI in schools? What's happening with AI in young people? And are you a glass half full or a glass half empty kind of a person? Should AI be banned, for instance? Should kids be allowed to just use AI to do their homework? We could probably ask the front row. Oh, we've got a no already. What are your thoughts about AI and kids?
Well, on the worrisome side, we already see some countries now discussing banning AI. What does that even mean is my first reaction. But where I see interesting changes in use happening is that the first kind of movement or the first types of use young people were doing with, particularly with generative AI tools, was in this kind of information seeking space, and that's where a lot of the conversation was, like using ChatGPT or equivalent to write papers for school and pass exams and so forth. But the shift is towards more personal use, using it as a coach, life advice, mental health therapist, planner. And so there I see really interesting things happening we should further study and in partnership with young people because we don't fully grasp what's going on.
Anyone else?
So if I could just jump in quickly. So we did a recent study, very small study, looking at young people's safety in the metaverse on VR platforms. And we worked with a youth panel through our partner ChildNet, and I know that Will is here today and speaking later. And that panel of young people used AI very effectively in their studies. They enjoyed using it. They use it for educational purposes. They use it in a personal sense as well, as you mentioned. So I think what we need to do in the context of our discussions around perhaps future threats, so our work was around the metaverse, is to think about how young people can be enabled in those situations, safeguarded but enabled, because we want to be encouraging them to use the technology to the fullest extent and to benefit from it.
Do you want to go, Jess?
Sure. With another hat on, I'm the director of our Graduate School of Education, so I actually spend quite a bit of time thinking of this for our university students as well, beyond, as we're getting a little bit older here. So this is already a discussion we're having. What students do we have coming in to us, right? And I think there's a couple things. One, I'm unclear what we mean by AI. AI is, or do we mean generative AI? What do we mean here? So, right, but if I'm focusing on generative AI, which has led to quite a bit of discussions, with every new technology, something is lost, something is gained, and a moral panic is part of it. That is our history. That is the starting point. We are going to go through this again right now. And when every new technology comes, we have to take a pause and think, what do we hold sacred? And what are we going to sacrifice? And in this case right now, the conversation is, what is generative AI offering? And what might we let go? And if we identify something sacred in this that we don't want to let go, then we need to think about in the school systems how we protect it. There's things we have lost when Google came, right? Young people 25, 30 years ago used encyclopedias and actually knew how to search for topics this way. Can you imagine asking somebody, any of us even today, how to do this? So we have to just take a moment, and that is a societal movement. That is a cultural discussion. What we see right now is that we are in the struggle train right now. Do we think that being able to write is important? If the answer is yes, how do we use generative AI to assist in the learning process, but not replace that? Do we think that knowing how to prompt is important? If so, how are we doing that? Do we think that being aware of how generative AI is created and what it is giving back is important? Are we getting young people to think about the biases in this information or not, and understanding that? It connects very easily because it relies on emotional components and emotional language. That's why it works so well with all of us, because we recognize that as humans. But are we making sure that young people are thinking through this? So actually, there's an entire idea of responsible AI that we could be teaching. There is a conversation to be had about on whose backs are we building the very technology that we are using, and what is the impact in spaces like sustainability? These are all conversations to have. It leads to a bigger set of, in the Netherlands, we would call this exit qualifications. What are the things we expect a young person should have when they leave? So what I think we're sitting in right now is the messy middle of the cultural conversation of what we hold value to. What do we find sacred? What will we sacrifice? And how do we do that in the process? But in all of these versions, young people need to be at the table as part of these conversations so we can learn how they're using them. And we do need to recognize it's not going away. And so figuring out how we help them engage in this is incredibly important. My first year bachelor students' first question to me was, will you teach me how to use ChatGPT because my boss says I need to, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do? We do hold a responsibility to thinking through this, but it's not something that we know the answers to quite yet.
Great answer. Pete, any thoughts on this?
Oh, I can't beat that. That was really good, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. We could go straight to lunch if you like.
Yeah, this is all done. No, I think the conversation about AI is in some ways the same conversation about social media and phones and video games before, in that we don't really learn the lessons from past panics. And part of the reason for that is because technology moves at such a quicker rate that we can have these very deep conversations societally or figure out how to do the science right. But there are still lessons that we can learn. And one of the big ones here is, how do we build good digital literacy programs at a national or maybe international level that are future-proof to a certain extent? We can't predict everything, but we're going to go through this again in 10 years' time with something that we don't know exists yet, right? So how do we think about, how do we approach those conversations as educators, as parents, that we have to get to grips with this technology as well, and then figure out how children and young people are using it. But we can do that in a bit of a quicker way than how we're doing things now, which is, this is new, here's a horror story, panic button, let's get rid of it because that will fix it. And we know that never fixes anything.
Yeah, we're not good at learning from the past. I mean, so the advent of the movies, radio, television, even comic books caused uproar. Even the bicycle, by the way, was banned in southern Bavarian towns, I found in Wikipedia the other day, because, that's where I found myself. And the reason it was banned was that young women could get on these bicycles and then go unaccompanied to nearby villages to meet with, young men and women on their own. So, yeah, even bikes were a cause of panic at one point.
I don't think you can tell whether you're in a moral panic until you come out of it, because there's a hindsight element to this. But it sure does look like it in a lot of ways, that that we see very similar things compared to those. If you look at the repeal of the paper tax in the UK in the 1800s, there was this big panic about this proliferation of novels and penny dreadful comics, but the picture was always of women, and the worry was around, what is this going to do to women and children? There's a very paternalistic element to this very often.
Yeah.
And we see elements of that in the discussions and the arguments with the current panics as well.
Right. I mean, the only issue, and then we'll move on, all the ones that we just talked about had 10, 20 years between them, but we're on an exponential curve right now. And who knows what we're going to be looking at in 3 to 6 months' time, because that's how fast it's moving.
Which makes it very hard to be a researcher. because by the time we launch the study, something else keeps changing. And so we're running as fast as we can to try to keep up right now, which is also where collaboration with companies and places who know what's forthcoming and can say, here's on the horizon, can actually help facilitate work. We see this, we're demonstrating this, we're playing around internally. Can you get ahead of it? That's where collabs are needed.
Well, that was a later question. Why don't we stay with
Sorry.
that? So you've got companies here and online. What would you like from them? What would you like to say to them about how they could help you with this work?
I mean, that would be my starting point. I am happy to sign whatever piece of paper I need to sign that says, I don't know what's coming yet, but if you could give me a hint so that I can start working on it, because I feel like I keep running after it. By the time it's on the field, it's too late in the game, because it takes me a little, I can work fast, but not that fast. So if you can have, and at the same time, I am very happy, and I think so many of my scholars are collegial scholars are happy to sit in a room and say, here's the voice from science that we would see, and have us at some way at the table. We don't, just being able to brainstorm, here's the missing perspective of youth that we might be able to offer, here's the missing perspective of parent that we might suggest, or here's how we see it could be concerning, and how can you address that ahead of time? Because sometimes I see things like the conversation with Gen AI. A big conversation around with young people is how they are using it as a mental health tool right now. And in many places and spaces around the world, they have very little access to mental health right now. There's a high demand on it. There's very long waiting lists, and they're using this. And when you talk to people who are in the background working on this and thinking of it for young people, that use was never a conversation that was thought.
No.
And we're seeing it and saying, we're worried. But if you had talked to us, we would have said, we anticipate this is how they will use it too.
Anyone else on this?
I just wanted to add something around the research issue, because I think that's absolutely true, and it's a big frustration for us. And I think one of the key problems is actually the funding for research. Certainly in the UK and in Europe, you know, the funding process, the process of bid writing, it took us a year to write our European bid. It takes the European Commission months and months to decide to fund it, if they do. And then by that time, perhaps the issue has become out of date in this space. So, you know, I think there's something about the funding landscape as well that's really problematic. I mean, we almost need a kind of rapid response approach to research in this area where it's really light touch bids, quick funding, so we can deliver the findings in a timely way. I think it's a real problem.
Can we shift gears? Can we talk about the research that you guys, and full disclosure, we've been involved too. It's called the New Frontiers. Do we want to say a word?
I was just going to say thank you for being part of the working group. I'm now happy to talk about it. So we have been, and which speaks to you how fast we are actually in academia doing research. So we engaged in a 1-year-long project, thanks to a commitment by Apple, hosted by the Technical University of Munich, the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and the University of Zurich, centered around a working group of 35 people, which FOSI was part of, that tried to shift the perspective from this kind of bans and very complex, very heated debate towards 4 areas, or 4 approaches as we call it, where we know we have evidence and where we think we can make a difference. So we didn't have much time. In a year long, we convened multiple times and thought, okay, what can we actually say about these 4 areas? So the first area was around trust. So how can we build or erode trust? The second one was around help seeking. So how do young people seek help? What do we know about that? The third one was about on-device approaches. So what can you do particularly at the phone level? And the fourth one was around education. And the report is coming out at the end of the month, as I said, but maybe a couple of highlights. So in terms of trust, what we know is that overly restrictive approaches, all these bans and the like, they tend to erode trust. So I'm curious to see what it does to families, to what it does to the relationship of students and schools, for instance, but also more broadly. So we see a shift towards more collaborative approaches, or that would be the ideal. And in this trust bucket, there is also kind of this forbidden fruit effect. So if you ban things, you actually sometimes make it even more attractive. So that's a problem. But yeah, the second one is around the help-seeking and on-device approaches there. We can say that it's really important to act in the moment when something happens, when harm happens, you need to have the right mechanisms in place on the platforms, on the devices, and we see a huge importance of peers and friends. Not new, but I think it's important to highlight that that's something we need to work on. And then in terms of schools, we do know from past research that holistic approaches work best. So not the one-day safety course over there, but you integrate learning about safety into all subject matters, and ideally you do it in participation with young people. But the report is about 100 pages. I hope it will be a very foundational report that lasts for years, and it has really not just a summary of evidence, but lots of solutions and things we need to work on.
And we'll have Ruben from Apple to talk about it further this afternoon. And it's a model, which is not the European Union funding process. It was a company that generously stood up and said, no, we'll put some money on this, which is very, very helpful. I'm going to come to you guys in a moment for questions, so think about that. Pete, you mentioned that there's your book in everyone's bag. What's the TDLR? Whatever that means. Too long. No, TLDR. Whatever it is. What's the? I haven't had my coffee.
Where am I? What's going on?
What should everyone walk away thinking about your book? How about that?
So the reason that I wrote the book and the reason why it's not done as well as others in the area. That shall not
That's
be named.
such an English thing to do. Don't do that. It's a brilliant book, people. It's a great read.
I mean, it says a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today, right? The research is messy. If you're going out there trying to go, here's a thing that I really worry about, how can science help me come to a definitive conclusion? Very often the answer is, it can't, sorry. And it's a very frustrating thing in that sense, because that actually is not helpful for a lot of people. I find it very reassuring to, when somebody comes along very convincingly and says, here is this clear bad thing that's going on, to be able to say, well, actually, things are more complicated than that, allows you to take a bit of a pause and go, okay, well, how do we actually navigate this properly? I can also see how it's not helpful, because in that moment, if you're a parent in particular, in that moment when you're having an argument about Fortnite or whatever it is, you want some support, you want some help. So the thing that I sort of tried to do with the book towards the end, and have been doing since it came out, is thinking about how do we do, given the evidence is the evidence, this is what the research is like, how do we actually help parents and young people, particularly in this space, to develop healthier relationships with the technology that they use, and also by extension with each other as well, so we're not arguing all the time. One of the things that really frustrates me about the sort of panicked nature of the argument that we've had over the past year, the sort of fear-based approach to things being really bad, is that I've had so many conversations with parents who are in just absolute despair. They'll say things like, I gave my 14-year-old a smartphone and it's too late. I don't know what to do now. And it's just the wrong message. Like, that it's okay. We can figure these things out. It's not a disaster. But it's thinking about constructively, how can we model the behaviors that we want to see in our children and young people, that we were never taught, obviously. So we need to develop them as well, because that's good for us as well. So it's thinking about that. It's thinking about sort of healthier relationships, I guess.
Brilliant. Yeah, we often say kids will do what you do, not what you tell them to do, right? If you're always on your phone. Actually, it's the number one complaint I get from kids when I work in schools. I can't get my mom's attention. She's always on Facebook. I went to cuddle my dad, but he was just checking his email.
We really struggle with it, right? And this is something that I struggle with this as well. We all have bad habits with our tech. Right? We're not addicted to our phones. It's not a thing. We have we have good habits as well. But the first step in trying to change those is actually recognizing them. And this is something that I found with the book. Like I've got a 5-year-old daughter now, but she was about 2.5, 3 when I first started writing. That I'd be on my phone and I wanted to model healthier behaviors in front of her, and the first time that happened, she's like, what are you doing on my phone? And my mental model was, I want to spend more time with her. So I went, nothing, and put my phone away. That's the worst thing that you can do, right? Because what that models that this is a thing that we don't talk about, that is very enticing and exciting, but is not for you. And that's like the opposite of what we're going to do. I still spend more time than I want to on my phone in front of my kids now, but when they call me out on it, I go, I was checking emails and it's really boring. Here, have a look. And they get bored by that as well, but it demystifies it and we have a conversation about it, and that's the important thing.
Did you hear that, parents? Bored the hell out of your kids. You know, they won't want your screens. Okay, can we have the lights up again and just check to see what, yes, we have a question here. If you could tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Laura from Roblox. I want to follow up on what Jess was saying. I mean, one thing, we realised more research is needed, particularly within tech platforms. So with that aside, but when there is a moral panic, what suggestions do you have of how tech platforms can help to de-escalate the situation? Because my experience is we're always met with cynicism of like, you're only trying to defend your platform or, you know, the tools that you have. So do you have any ideas of how we can all work together to try to reduce some of this panic?
That's a great question. That's a great question, and I don't have an easy answer. I will say that you are met with cynicism. I think companies are going to be. I'm not sure that's going to change easily. I think changing that narrative is also difficult, but being able to partner with building real advisory boards of academicians who actually are able to say, I'm not connected to this in any way, right? I'm a neutral party here. This is really what they're doing, and listening to that can help. For sure, because it gives it another space and says we're talking to this group, and also recognizing moral panics don't come from nothing, right? They wouldn't stick if there wasn't something there. So if you hear that there is fear, and to make it a concrete example, I don't know what to do, I'm worried about my kids, and you as a company, not you per se, but as a company, you say, we have 55 things that a parent can do. Have you actually talked for a second with the parents to see, do they know even where these 55 are? And is that actually possible for them? So actually, I think there's two steps. One, it's actually listening, where is this coming from? And identifying, is there action that can be taken within the parameters of the company? And two, finding additional parties to help you dig through that a little bit and give respecting the voice that's coming, and then trying to switch the narrative with the help of others too.
Cool, yeah.
If I could just respond to that too. Hi. So I think the answer is collaboration, really more collaboration. So we've been collaborating with some great industry partners recently, and a little plug for a great piece of research that was funded by Netflix as well that looks at parental attitudes. You've got these on the tables outside, so please do have a look at that research. I consulted on it, and I think those kind of partnerships are absolutely key, because I think what we're bringing to the table is evidence. You know, a knowledge of evidence that isn't just around our own research, so it's around the research landscape as well. So evidence is absolutely key, and using evidence to make your case.
Okay. We are quickly running out of time, so I'm just going to throw it back to any of you. What should we be hopeful about in this space? Is there any room for optimism?
There's always room for optimism.
That was the answer. That's what we're looking for. Sandra.
Well, I started saying I'm an optimist, so of course there should be room for optimism. But maybe I end with something less optimistic. So I think one of the takeaways from many of the conversations that I'm having with people, particularly around youth and mental health and the current state of young people's well-being, is that we, optimists, we expect young people to be well. And we want young people to be well, and I truly believe in that. We need to work on that, and it's a problem if they are unwell. But the world right now is so complex, nuts, I would say, that not being healthy is a sign of good health. And so while we need to work on it, and it's a problem, I think somewhere in that sentence lies some truth, I think.
Wow, okay. Anybody else?
To say something, yeah. I mean, I think if I can find some optimism in the midst of the work that I've done, you know, I've worked extensively, as I said, with victims who've suffered the most horrendous abuse. But I think in terms of optimism, certainly in terms of the research we do with young people, is their joy and their pleasure and the way in which they absolutely embrace every new aspect of technology continues to give me optimism, I think.
Brilliant. Last words, Pete.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, and I think it's been a difficult year in terms of the conversation that we've had around this. It's been very heated, very vitriolic. I do also get the sense that there is more awareness happening now, that parents are seeing through some of the scariest stuff and going, actually, what can I find that will help me? And people are talking about it more. And that's only going to be a good thing. This is sort of the consistent thing that a lot of us say, is that communication is so important in this space. Building support networks, talking to each other about what we're doing online, getting rid of that sense of guilt that we have about our phones and our screens, and just admitting that it's okay that sometimes we get things wrong and we're always trying to fix things. Like, I genuinely believe everybody in this debate, regardless of what your views are on the science or whatever, is trying to do the right thing. We're all trying to create safer online spaces and experiences, and I think we are getting there.
Brilliant.
And so long as we have places like this that keep happening, we have room for optimism.
Brilliant. On that excellent note, folks, please thank this wonderful panel. And there is lunch is waiting for us back there, and please make use of the garden as well. And we'll see you back here in about 3/4 of an hour.